I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hammond, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to another episode of Dr. J Radio Live. I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels. My guest happens to also be right here in the City of Angels. But before we get to him, first I want to tell you all that we are internationally syndicated, first with Late Night in the Midlands and also Black Swamp Digital Radio in the United States. And in the UK, we have Deprogrammed Radio Network. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a story that many of you who've paid attention to this show for years probably have heard, but the new listeners may not have heard because this is going to tie into the introduction of our guest. I'm going to take back the time 11 plus years ago, summer of 2007. And I'd been seeing all sorts of things on History Channel because they were talking about the anniversary of Roswell. So I walked over to the Grove and I was looking for a book on UFOs. I found one and I bought it. I brought it back to my apartment at the time, and I got to tell you, I was very disappointed. It was almost as if it was written by a skeptic. Can they reach this distance? Can they travel at the speed of light? How do they factor in all these other, conventional physics? And I was not happy. I was kind of hoping for something that talked about cases, that talked about sightings, maybe even had not videos, obviously, if it's a book, but pictures and eyewitnesses of abductions. So I went back to Barnes & Noble and said, please tell me you have something else on UFOs or ETs. And they said, we don't think so. The one you have in your hand, which is what I brought back, they wouldn't take it back, of course, is the only one we have. And I said, can you please look again? So I walked with one of the employees to the section, the paranormal section, which at the time was not as big as it should be. And hidden behind several other books was a book that they didn't even know they had. And the title was UFOs over California. Prior to that, because it had been the anniversary of Roswell that summer, that July, the History Channel had a series of different documentaries from, of course, Roswell, China's Roswell, Texas Roswell, British Roswell. And I was like, wow. And then, of course, Kecksburg, too. And I didn't know there was that many crash and retrievals. But then I got this book, UFOs over California. And I got to tell you, from the moment I started to read it, I could not put it down. I literally finished it in one reading. This book, I'm holding it in my hand right now, talks about in California so many different crash and retrievals that I never even thought were possible. And when I come to find out later on is that it is not an uncommon occurrence to have one of these crash and retrievals that happen. Of course, they're not going to publicize it because unlike Roswell, the media didn't get to it before the military could cover it up. At the end of the book, there was, let me read it to you folks right now. To contact the author, please email him at so-and-so. And I did. And sure enough, I got a response. His name was Mr. Preston Dennett. Me and Preston met for dinner a couple weeks later, and it just so happened to be very convenient that we both shared the same area code. So that was even a better thing that we were that close as far as proximity as where we lived. And then I got to talking to him more, and I found out there was a lot more that I really didn't know. Because back in 2007, I was literally just a passive observer, passive researcher, not an active one. So we stayed in touch, and it wasn't until 2012 when I started working for Third Phase of the Moon, and then I started bringing them guests for their UFO YouTube channel, and then they started having a radio show on Blog Talk Radio. When Lorian Fenton told me that I should do my own show on Revolution Radio, and I did name it Third Phase of the Moon Radio at first, the first person that came to my mind to be my co-host was the author of this book, Preston Dennett. Now, you guys and gals listening all over the globe must be living under rocks if you don't recognize this name. He has done a lot for this community. He has published a lot of books. I'm going to let him tell you all about them when we get to that. 3 recently, and that's not including the in my library. I mean, there is, I don't want to say 17 because I could be off, but I'm pretty sure it's more than that. So without further ado, now that you got the little background of how me and Preston Dennett go back to 11 years ago, and how we started 5.5 years ago, March 2013, co-hosting together on Revolution Radio, my eyes and my mind were so expanded and full of knowledge. And that's one great thing about radio, folks. What I learn from guests is really amazing. And even from you listeners, not just from your comments or your feedback, but throughout you listeners, there are those gems who have another missing key or piece of the puzzle. And those people sometimes end up becoming guests. The point being is, if it wasn't for Preston, I would not be here where I am today. And so with the bottom of my heart, Preston, I have to thank you for turning me on to this in a far bigger way than mainstream media can ever do.
Thanks, Dr. J. Yeah, well, I appreciate it.
Well, let's correct the number of books I said. I said 17, but I have a feeling it's more than that, including the 3 new ones.
Yeah, it's getting up there now. I think I'm at 22, 23, right around there.
Yeah, see, that would make sense that I would have 17 of his books. Now, after UFOs over California, you've written, I know, over Colorado, UFOs over New York, UFOs over New Mexico, UFOs over Nevada. Am I missing any other states? Arizona?
Arizona, yeah. New Mexico, did you say that?
Yes.
Yeah, pretty much the Southwest, and then New York.
And New York was a fascinating one, by the way. I have read them all. And for everybody out there, if you live in any of those states, even if you don't, but if you do live in those states, I highly suggest to grab that book, because you're going to be able to see the events that took place and maybe able to picture it in your mind of what it looked like. I'm talking about the setting, because it's very detailed. Now, Preston knows this, and I'm going to tell my secret to everybody. Every time he publishes another UFOs over said state, I always go to a couple of the chapters first, and then I read from the beginning to the end. I'm going to tell you right now, going through the contents of UFOs over California, the first things that I ended up reading obviously was the invasion of Edwards Air Force Base. That was great. And then California UFO crash retrievals, which really blew my mind, and landings in humanoids, and then of course UFO abductions in California. And then everything else of course falls into play, because everything is relevant. You will not get bored of any one of Preston's books. He is one of the best authors and the greatest researchers to this field of ufology. I don't think we'd be where we are if it wasn't for him. Now, let's talk about, because we're in California and it's been quite some time, Preston, that I put you on the spot. I know it's been a while since you've written this book. Let's go through some of the crash and retrievals specific to California.
Oh, I mean, this is what actually really surprised me when I first wrote that book. Like you mentioned, I knew about Roswell. I knew about the Paradise Valley crash, Kecksburg, Aztec. Had no idea that pretty much every state that I've researched so far has their own list of crash retrievals. Or, one that comes to mind with California is Norton Air Force Base. Now, they've been deeply implicated in actually holding one of these craft. This was back in 1988. A gentleman by the name of Mark McCandlish, he's an aero design expert, was invited there. And he wasn't meant to see these craft, but that's what he saw. He was the guy who invited him, says, you weren't supposed to see this. You're going to have to remain quiet about it. Just let's get through it. But he described these three typical flying saucers, metallic circular craft. They were floating inside a little warehouse there, right there in Norton Air Force Base.
Now, wasn't this during an air show and the people, the VIPs, that's the best way to put them, were in that other hangar as opposed to everybody else being shown the terrestrial equipment as opposed to the super, I don't want to say anything super, but anything that didn't originate from us, or at least the technology didn't originate from us? Because isn't that one of the common themes to do, is to, point left, have everyone go one direction when the secret stuff is happening on the right.
Right.
Some people call it a Kansas City shuffle. One of the things that struck me of the crash and retrievals was this one case. I believe it happened to be it was definitely California, on the California side of the California and Mexico border. And when I read it, it talked about this couple was watching on TV, this anchorman, where it showed behind him a crash disc stuck in the sand. And what it was diagonal, literally sticking out. And the anchorman was saying that they were tenderly attending to this 3-foot creature, or maybe even smaller than that, at San Diego Hospital. And immediately that cut out. How did you find out about that case?
Right. I mean, this is what I did, is I surveyed all the UFO literature. And I started to find all these little gems. I remember that one. That was Leon Kreis and his wife were watching the news, and up pops this UFO story, and they can see this craft. And what's funny is there's a number of cases like this where news stories have slipped out. This happened during the Roswell UFO crash. Famous newscaster was driving through Roswell and was hearing the whole story as it unfolded until it cut off. So yeah, I mean, there's all these little gems throughout the UFO literature. I believe I found this in the UFO News Clipping Service. I'd have to look up the source. But that was a great source for sure. All these old newspaper clippings from the 1960s.
I wonder what happened to that poor anchorman. I'm wondering if he was canned from his job or sent to Alaska or something like that, because, in his mind, he was doing good journalistic work, but in the eyes of the superiors, clearly he was violating, I guess, the national defense, if that's what you want to call it in that era. So in some way, I feel really sorry for that guy, because to be cut off from that program and then, like I said, probably despised. You've never heard of that anchorman appearing somewhere else later in life, have you?
I don't know. I'd have to look that up. But I do know that there's been plenty of reprisals. I mean, a typical example is Sergeant Charles Moody. He was a scientist who went out to watch a meteor shower and ended up having an abduction. And following his abduction, he started talking about it, and was shortly later he was shipped off to some foreign country. And that's kind of their MO in a lot of these types of cases.
Yeah, to get them away, one, for punishment, and two, so they don't talk. And obviously, if they get them away and they are punishing them, then they're going to learn to keep their mouth shut. The difference is, though, is following World War II, if the government told you to shut up, people were patriots, and they did. But I think times have changed in that I think if people were suppressed from something like this happening, where it involved a large number of witnesses, I don't think people would say, okay, yes, this is good for our country, we're going to keep this under wraps and go about their business. There had to have been something that was going on, well, obviously post-war, but America was more together than it is divided today, which is why I'm kind of hoping one of these gems pops out. Now, do I wish any ill on any extraterrestrial dying in a crash? Absolutely not. But I think it would just be great. One thing me and you talked about is to see the wreckage from Roswell. That's what I think would be great, for us to have the ability to go into a museum and see what they've collected over the years. Will that ever be a possibility? In my mind, I don't think ever. But
I think it could happen. I think people vastly underestimate how much UFO hardware we have. it's secreted all over the United States. It's, Edwards, there's Wright-Patterson, Norton. A number of these military bases are neck deep in this stuff and heavily implicated. This stuff is going to come out.
Now, one good thing about UFOs over California, there was one chapter that was devoted to one topic because that topic was so important. And you labeled it, I believe, the invasion of Edwards Air Force Base. Let's talk about that because some of the characters involved are pretty stunning, and especially the fellow from the UK who wrote that letter to corroborate what he said. These just more pieces that I love to hear. And I think the people listening would definitely love to hear this story more in detail than they probably heard it before.
Yeah, I mean, I had to devote a whole chapter to it. And honestly, I could have probably written a book just on Edwards Air Force Base and what's going on there. Because this area, which is where we, test our highest advanced aerospace technology, this area has been a magnet for UFOs from day one. I mean, literally back in, it was established in 1933 or so. And it was, not long after that it started to have UFO sightings. 1947, is when this huge superwave swept across the United States. And Edwards Air Force Base was one of the first places that was targeted. And it ended up being one of the unidentified cases in Air Force Blue Book, where a bunch of people who were on the base, officers, lieutenants, and so on, observed this metallic object hovering overhead, about maybe 8,000 feet. And a lot of people saw this. And this is just the sightings. Pretty much every couple of years, this would happen. These huge wave of sightings, and it got to be very well known at the base. It's been caught on radar a number of times. Some very, very well authenticated cases of sightings alone have occurred over Edwards Air Force Base. But that's just the tip of the iceberg.
It really is, because in 54, something major happens.
Right. I mean, we haven't talked about landings.
No, we haven't.
There's been a number of landings at Edwards observed by officers and actually filmed, as reported by, our astronaut, Gordon Cooper, who actually observed the film that had been taken. He was there when it happened. I'm not sure if he actually observed it or not. But he turned it up to his superiors, and you've never seen this footage again. And it's out there somewhere, this authentic footage of a UFO just landing, and right there on Edwards Air Force Base.
And he was very detailed about that. He talked about when he was looking through the film and he was holding it up to the light, how the craft seemed to let out three, legs or tripod for it to land before it sat there for a while and took off. And obviously, Gordon Cooper, the astronaut, I mean, he's a true American hero, and may he rest in peace. But that wasn't his first sighting, and he was one of the earliest advocates as far as astronauts. Of course, we also had Edgar Mitchell, who we have to thank, and also him rest in peace. But like you said about that footage, I would hope somebody somewhere out there, another Snowden, and no, I'm not trying to get anyone who's working in the NSA or CIA or any of these private military contractors to get yourself in trouble by releasing this, but I do hope it's been enough time, folks. We should be able to see it. Let me ask you this, Preston. If they're not going to show that, which clearly at the time frame it would have had to been black and white footage, why in your mind do you think this past December, maybe January, the DoD released 2 videos of objects that were not aerodynamic, that were doing things that are not consistent with conventional physics, and you hear the pilots who are filming them talking about that. So if they're willing to show us that coming straight from them, because they could have kept that under wraps too, but they didn't. Right.
And I'm so glad there was at least some movement in this whole cover-up, because information coming from official circles is, we're just not getting any. And finally we got a little bit, and thanks for the tiny little drop there, by the way, but I've seen better footage. That's one kind of thing that's disappointing. And I'm sure that it's kind of like, here, look at this footage here. All right behind them, right behind the curtain there is the entire craft and bodies. So it's very tightly controlled. And I think they're doing it because they have to. If they don't start disclosing, they're going to lose control of the whole UFO situation and the knowledge that's coming out. Because there's a huge trend towards disclosure. Cat's out of the bag. A lot of people from high levels have disclosed, and they're not being prosecuted. To do so would be to sort of admit that the validity of their claims. So there's almost a free time now to reveal what you know. And pretty much every UFO investigator I know who's had a bunch of cases has talked to whistleblowers.
One thing about living in the times we do now is the younger generation, if you ask them if we are alone, without a doubt, they don't hesitate. I mean, it is very rare for me to find somebody who is of early college age or even in their teenage years as a high school person and ask them, hey, do you believe in UFOs? Do you believe in ETs? Do you think we've been visited? And like I said, almost every one of them says yes. Because what they were taught in elementary school is far different than what me and you are taught. And I think this is a great thing. Like you said, if they don't start releasing this information to us, it's going to get out of the bag. The cat's going to get out of the bag in a way they do not intend it to. And if they can't control it, well, then all the money and all those projects and all the compartmentalization that occurs will eventually be worthless if they can't contain it. Now, I'm going to go back again to Edwards Air Force Base because there is a very key thing. So I'm going to have you continue to talking about the landings, which ultimately involved POTUS.
Right. Well, I mean, here's another thing. There's a number of cases where people have actually seen UFOs being worked on at Edwards Air Force Base. A good example, in 1973, Kent Sellen, who worked there as a crew chief on experimental aircraft, was ordered to go off to the North Base to pick up a ground power unit, which was not unusual, but he decided he's going to save time. Instead of taking the road, he's going to dart straight across the dry lake bed there, comes upon these Quonset huts, and inside are these flying saucers. Next thing, as soon as he sees it, there's a machine gun barrel right at his throat, and here's, a voice say, close your eyes and get on the ground, or we're going to blow your head off.
With deadly force. That's sad that they literally have to keep the secret up so much that they're willing to kill other humans. And I would be surprised if people were not killed over this, because that's how much they want to keep this classified. But they're not doing a very good job, because these different entities that are visiting us from other planets, other dimensions, other I guess you could say even timelines, wherever they are so vast and are occurring at such a higher rate, because the evolution of humanity in the last, say, even 100 years, but you could even shorten it and go back to the early space age. We have been literally skyrocketing as far as what our capabilities are. And I have a feeling that one of the worries about the international is the wrong word, but the intergalactic communities is that we humans are not very responsible. And isn't that one of the things that actually was a reason to have a meeting and a treaty?
Well, I think, that's what I'm kind of leading up to. But the point I wanted to establish is just how saturated Edwards Air Force Base is with this phenomena. That guy who drove up to the saucers being worked on, they put a hood over him and questioned him for the next 24 hours, threatened him not to tell, but told him that, these were UFOs operated on anti-gravity. And I got another report. This one is not in the book. This is someone who contacted me from a hospital on their deathbed and really wanted this information out. He was a contractor, and he had been assigned to Edwards Air Force Base, and was walking along there with his employer when they walked by this warehouse. There's this tiny little, 20-foot maybe metallic saucer hovering there. And the guy I interviewed turns to his employer and says, "What's that?" And his employer wouldn't answer and just kept walking and said, motioned him not to talk. And the guy I interviewed asked him afterwards, "What was that?" And he says, "I can't tell you." And he refused to tell him no matter how much he asked. Well, years later, the employer calls up again and wants another job done. And the guy I interviewed says, "Well, I'll do it." The contractor says, "I'll do it, but you have to tell me what I saw, 10 years ago or whatever it was." And the guy says, "Okay," and admitted that it was extraterrestrial technology, that they had reverse engineered it. Whether that was an actual UFO or something we had made, he wouldn't say. So that's kind of the point I wanted to make. And this is only the half of it. Then you have what happened in, what you've been wanting to get to, is on February 20th, 1954, Eisenhower, right?
Yes.
This is crazy, and I know how this might sound to skeptics, but all the evidence that's coming forth continues to corroborate this event. On that day, the president disappears. Press has no idea where he is. They're going crazy. One newspaper actually says he's been murdered or had a heart attack. Turned out, he turns up later. No, it was an emergency dental visit. Now, researchers have found out that there was no dental visit. And immediately after this event occurred, all these leaks started coming out that the president had actually, and a large group of very highly placed officials, by the way, had been taken to Edwards Air Force Base to not only view extraterrestrial craft and bodies, but meet with live ETs. And know how this sounds, but a pilot saw this. There's a bunch of people who were there who reported this, and there are continuing leaks on this case, and it hasn't been fully busted open, but the information that's come out now is completely corroborated that apparently the president spoke with these ETs, and they had this whole kind of discussion.
One thing that has always blown me away is the people that were there, along with President Eisenhower. Just some of the names is Albert Einstein, Werner von Braun, the father of the space program, brought here by the Project Paperclip, because he was a former Nazi and he was a big guy in the V2 rockets, and we probably would have never gotten to the Apollo programs or even the Gemini programs if it wasn't for Werner von Braun and Howard Hughes. These are pretty big names, but then again, if I was the president, and Preston, I'm sure if you were, and you had to think, who would I bring aside from some generals and other people like that to have this historic meeting? You'd want to bring some of the smartest people on this planet, as well as one of the greatest aviators of the time.
Right. They brought, let's see, it was Franklin Allen of Hearst Papers, Edward Norris of the Brookings Institute. He was a financial advisor to Truman. So all these high-level people in all different types of parts of our culture were invited to this. There was one guy, Gerald Light, who was actually a UFO researcher and scientist, and it was he who kind of provided the first real leak. He wrote this letter to his friend Meade Lane, and that letter went public. And it described how all these scientists were just going out of their minds. They tried to study these craft, how the ETs had the ability to turn their craft invisible. Apparently, the discussion was about a number of subjects. The ETs wanted to teach spiritual information, and we weren't really interested in that. We were interested in their technology. They did not want to give up their technology. They wanted us to stop using nuclear weapons. Now, we didn't want to do that. And they also wanted to push towards disclosure. And we hemmed and hawed on that as well, fearing that this would cause disruptions in religion and politics and economics and so on. According to some reports, there was a ride actually taken in these craft. So I don't know exactly what happened, but the number of sources coming out are well over a dozen, and some high-level people reporting this kind of stuff.
One thing about that letter from Meade Lane, he talked about that President Eisenhower was going to make a public disclosure. Obviously, that didn't happen. My guess is probably as good as yours, but I'm guessing maybe the generals who are saying, wait a minute, we have these new species here who are more advanced than we are. They can control us remotely. They could slip in and out of our air defense without us knowing. And it's like night and day comparing our technology to them. I mean, in some ways, you could even look at it as comparing what we would have been hundreds of years ago to the technology we have today. So personally, I would just guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, do you think it was the generals that were there? Because this is before, maybe 54 was after the formation of the Air Force, because when Roswell happened, that was at RAAF, Roswell Army Airfield. Edwards Air Force Base at the time was Muroc Airfield. In 54 when this happened, was it Edwards Air Force Base? Was the Air Force actually established by then?
Yeah, I believe so.
Now, do you think it was those generals who said, hey, wait a minute, they're not giving us technology. They want us to stop using technology. They want us to give us the spiritual information, but that's not what we want. And therefore, we're not going to abide by them. Do you think that's probably what went down? I mean, it's only speculation, but that's all we could do at this point, unless we were able to actually interview some of these people who, unfortunately, most are no longer with us.
Right. Well, I mean, I think you have to look at it from a military standpoint. Me personally, as a citizen, I think we have the right to know, and it's sort of their duty, their constitutional duty, to release this information. But from a military standpoint, we're dealing with visitors who we know next to nothing about, and who have the ability to basically, overpower us. So you have to view them as a threat if they have the potential to be a threat. You know what I mean? Even if they are friendly.
Yes, because that's their job. I mean, that is their job. After all, that's the way they're taught to think from the moment they enter the service. And one thing you mentioned, I also believe it is a crime against humanity to hide this from us. Okay, sure, there's going to be disruption in politics, religion, stock markets, but that would subside, and today, we'd be living in a far different and probably better world if we were coexisting instead of having all this secrecy and all those poor souls who were killed in this cover-up. There's only one more thing I want to talk about in UFOs over California. And for anybody out there listening, if you are in California or you'd like to know more about what's happened in California, definitely pick up UFOs over California. The one case that also stuck out to me, which was not a crash and retrieval, was this woman who was an abductee. And one night she recalls that she was taken and her young son was also taken. But she, at the very next morning at breakfast, she didn't want to mention to him because she didn't know if he remembered it at all. So she asks him, did you sleep okay? And I think he was eating cereal, and he says, yeah. And then all of a sudden he blurts out, yeah, and my alien friends came to visit me again. And she's, of course, startled. And he said, but they always get mad at me because every time they're having me walk through walls or pulling me through doors or, literally going through things that to us is physically impossible to walk through. The boy says that he stopped to see the little balls, and they would tell him that wasn't safe and that's why he can't stay. Now, in a child's perspective, talking about that, what it sounds like is that they're able to literally break down what we see as tangible things into molecules. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't the colored balls that he was looking at the different molecules that were that the wall or the door were composed of?
Well, in a sense, I mean, I'm not sure he was seeing the individual molecules, but what he was seeing was pretty incredible because, these ETs are able to apparently polarize the molecules and atoms in solid objects and render them transparent, render them permeable. This kind of explains a lot about the interdimensionality of UFOs because it's all connected, and they are mastered sort of the other dimensions and are able to take matter and energize it or do something to it. Case after case like this. I mean, I had one guy who asked the ETs about this, and they demonstrated it twice. Turned his entire roof invisible, and on another occasion, turned his entire bedroom, the dresser, it was all gone. He's like, there's his bed, and it's just out there looking at the yard. So,
now, I'm going to briefly talk about the other books of the other states, UFOs over the said states, and I'm going to ask you to pick the one crash and retrieval that stands out to you most. Let's start with Colorado.
gosh, I'd have to look that one up. I've written so many of these, they're starting to mix up. Colorado didn't have a lot, as I recall. There was, oh yeah, I remember Brownie Mountain. There was this weird event where NORAD calls up the local sheriff station and said, we've detected a heat source on Brownie Mountain. Would you go check it out? And apparently this was a very large explosion. At the time, there was a wave of sightings. The sheriff went up there and tried to find this thing, didn't find it. But this was followed by additional UFO sightings, a bunch of black helicopter activity, all kinds of contradictory statements coming back and forth from NORAD and various military bases, all of who denied any involvement or knowledge. But it was clear that they did have knowledge because there was all these official vehicles over the mountain. No one ever found out exactly what happened, but I know Christopher O'Brien, who's a local investigator there, dug deeply into this and did learn that there was someone who lost their life as a result of digging too deeply in this. Either committed suicide or made to look like they committed suicide.
Which seems like a very easy way for them to get people away. I mean, I know I've heard this over and over again where people are very happy, nothing's wrong with their lives, and all of a sudden they're talking about something that they shouldn't be talking about according to the higher ups, and they're found dead, usually by some sort of self-inflicted wound. But when you really look at the evidence much closer, you realize that sometimes that self-inflicted wound was more like assisted suicide, as if it was against their will. Real quick, with Colorado, and if you can't answer this question, don't worry about it. We'll go to the next state. Do you recall anything in your book that happened to do with the city of Loveland, Colorado?
Oh, I'm sure that there's something I can't say right off the bat, a Loveland case, but it does sound, the city sounds familiar to me, so I'm going to say, yeah, there's probably one in there.
Well, everybody out there, if you're in Colorado, well, there you go. Start with that. Okay, now let's go to Arizona. What's the one that sticks out in your head, the biggest crash and retrieval event? It doesn't have to be the biggest, but the one that just sticks out in your head the most.
Right. Well, there were a number there. There was a guy who was taken to a secret base and observed a craft in bodies by a friend of his. There was another guy, one case that had only one witness. That was interviewed by Wendell Stevens, I believe, a good researcher, where a fireman saw something. Gosh, where was that? It was Fort Huachuca, I believe it was. But, of course, the Paradise Valley crash is the one. That's probably in the top 5 of well-established events, because that one was actually one of the first that came out. It came out in Frank Scully's book. He mentioned it. And Raymond Fowler interviewed this guy who was... he gave the pseudonym Fritz Werner. His name ended up being, I believe it was Stansel. And he was taken on a blacked out bus to the site of the crash. It was his job to sort of determine how fast this object had come in based on the crash, the landing marks it had made. And he saw the craft, he saw bodies, a bunch of people did. There's been a number of witnesses who've come out in support of this particular incident. So that's probably the best one.
Another case that's not crash and retrieval that people would literally, if they're not paying attention to UFOs, you even if you weren't paying that much close attention, you would definitely know what we're going to talk about, because I happened to be there in March of 1997, except I missed it. The Phoenix Lights, Preston. Tell us about that real quick for those of people who, because it's been 21 years at this point, people who may have not known the details that you knew.
Yeah, I think it's the most widely viewed event in the United States, certainly in modern times, and viewed by thousands of people. Stopped traffic in the streets. People were running out of their homes. Hale-Bopp, the comet, was in view at the time. A lot of people were having comet parties. A lot of people saw this thing. First clue of it was when the National UFO Reporting Center up in Washington started getting a flood of calls, and they tracked this object moving north of Arizona, coming down over several cities, and then taking a circle over Phoenix, and did this actually twice or three times. Apparently there were multiple craft, but by and large, the witnesses described the craft in pretty much the same way. They say it was about 3,000 feet up, pretty low, and extremely large. Estimates vary from, at least football field size, but most say quarter mile, half mile in diameter. Huge, so huge that it covers the entire sky. It had like a series of lights on each end. Some people could see through the craft. Some said no, it was absolutely solid. Few heard any noise. A few described a very low humming noise. But yeah, so many people saw this. Luke Air Force Base was going crazy. They were on lockdown. They denied it. They were caught in a number of contradictory statements following this event. They're really caught red-handed and just behaving badly in their response to this. They did scramble planes. A number of witnesses saw this. This, again, they denied. The police stations received floods of calls, which they first admitted and then denied. So there's all kinds of weird scramblings in parts of city and federal government to cover this up. Frances Barwood, the city councilman, was approached, months afterwards to look into it. And she was really the only city official who did. And here's the weird thing. This event probably wouldn't have had the media explosion that it did if Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, in an attempt to confuse the issue, I think, let loose a bunch of flares. And when these flares went off, this was following the Phoenix Lights incident, a bunch of people filmed it, and that film got on the news, and that caused a bunch of witnesses to come forth, and there was sort of a media snowball effect. And yeah, what an event.
There's actually something that I've always wondered. That cult that committed suicide, Heaven's Gate, they were waiting for the Hale-Bopp comet to pass. But the Phoenix Lights, assuming obviously, all the evidence points to it not being us. Obviously, if it was, then they're testing the technology that we've received from somewhere else. But why would they do so over such a major city? But wasn't the time they committed suicide around that time because they were committing suicide so they can get into the spaceship that was following the Hale-Bopp comet? Yet the Hale-Bopp comet came and the Phoenix Lights happened, right after that because it was right behind it. Do you think that these people, and again, this is pure speculation, this is something I've wondered in my head for quite a long time when I put two and two together, do you think that there was any inclination, some of these people that were involved in Heaven's Gates, aside from the fact that they were pretty crazy to have a mass suicide and, their Nike shoes and the way they had their little ritual, but do you think somebody there was really into UFOs and maybe was paying attention to, or knew that maybe behind a comet, ETs or other UFOs or other craft are used to coming behind?
Well, Marshall Applewhite, the guy who headed it, was, he sort of used the UFO mythology. I'm not sure he was well educated on it. And there's no evidence that UFOs do follow comets or anything like this, other than perhaps hiding behind planetary bodies. So who knows? I don't know. It's actually, I think the Heaven's Gate cult did damage to the UFO field and the credibility of it. And it's unfortunate because for it to be connected to UFOs at all, because it really isn't.
Yes, I agree with that, Preston. It was actually very saddening for those poor souls and watching the videos that they created before they passed away, and they were all, happy to pass. But you're absolutely right. It just added to that tinfoil hat sort of reputation that people who were interested in the subject believed in. So you're right. It did really affect us, and fortunately, I think enough time has passed and enough credible people are starting to finally come out of their woodwork, and enough of the population is finally believing this. And I'll give you another example. Third Phase of Moon, they have over 600,000 subscribers right now. People are sending them videos every single day from around the world. They have the largest database of UFOs, and they're on top of it. Every single day there'll be something new that comes out, and this wouldn't have happened 30, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, even with the technology we have, the ability to film from our pockets. Everyone essentially has, if you have a mobile phone, usually nowadays you can't even buy one without a camera. But I don't think that companies such as Google would have even allowed the serious talk about this through YouTube had it been a couple decades earlier. Now, I'm going to get through these other states because we have some new books to talk about, and I want to get through these before we hit the break. So we've gone through 3 states already. We went through California, a few details there because I'm very biased, of course, as you know. Colorado, we went to Arizona. Let's go to Nevada.
Nevada. Well, let's see. Area 51 is what keeps coming to my mind because that's where we've got the real evidence of it. And what I want to say about Area 51 is this real interesting thing that I have not heard anywhere else. And that's when Fate magazine decided to do an experiment and ask people to psychically view inside Area 51. Go out of body, remote view, get psychic impressions, this sort of thing. And they got a bunch of responses, all from women, by the way, and they all found basically the same thing, which is what we've already sort of determined from whistleblowers and people who've been inside Area 51, which is that it's multi-leveled and that various levels specialize in research. One level is like genetics, another is bacterial diseases, another is reverse engineering UFOs, and the deeper you go, the higher level, more classified it is. But what I found real interesting is, there was about 4 of these respondents who said something I've never heard before, and it was all the same thing. They said, "This is strange. I'm seeing that the people who work, the employees who work at Area 51, have been altered by the aliens medically," is what one person said. Another said, "Well, they've been given implants to boost their health and boost their immune system and make them live much longer." Another said that they were medically altered to the point where they're almost not human, some of them. And a fourth one said the same thing. So all that they were implanted in some way and their health was changed and improved. That's just really bizarre.
30, 40 years ago, even in early 20 years ago, people talked about alien implants. I know people like Schumer, or I don't know, is that's his name, one of the great skeptics who owns Skeptic magazine. They were really taking the alien implants and what Dr. Roger Lear was doing for his living, removing them and just making fun of it. But he successfully removed 17 of these implants, and in conjunction with Third Phase of Moon, we've done 2 documentaries on Dr. Roger Lear and his implants. And for those of you who have not paid attention, since he also sadly passed away and no one has stepped up to pick up his work, I urge you all to pay attention, because those things that are inserted into us have qualities that are not consistent with what us humans can do conventionally. Again, I use the word conventionally because if the higher echelons of the government or the private military contractors who are in charge of these black projects I wouldn't be surprised if they too are also using this technology. Okay, let's go to New Mexico. Obviously, Roswell. I know most people, if not everybody, even if they don't believe that it was extraterrestrial, has heard about Roswell and Aztec. Not as many as Roswell, but a lot of people. Aside from those two, does any other crash and retrieval or any other incident from New Mexico stand out with you?
Oh yeah, but I'm not giving up on Roswell, by the way. I'm going to beat that dead horse until it comes out. But one that does come to mind was a witness uncovered, I believe, initially by Bud Hopkins, who was a nurse who was called to a car accident. Turned out it wasn't a car. It was this crumpled little UFO, one passenger apparently. And she's looking at this body and she thought, it's a child. This doesn't make any sense. It's got a little silver suit. It was badly burned. It was apparently dead, but she couldn't be sure. So she rushed it off to this little rinky-dink one-room hospital type deal in a small town, and is trying to care for it when she realizes this thing is not human. This is not human, or it's a mutant of some sort. And that's when the government shows up, clears everything out. Actually, the car that it was carried in, everything. Took all the pictures, all the tests they took, cleared it all out, and basically threatened him not to talk.
And that's a very similar tactic that they seem to use. Threaten you not to talk, as Bob Lazar said, non-disclosure agreement, and of course threaten you with I think life in prison or a long period of time, a very hard time, or they'll just have you make you look like you committed suicide, as we just talked about. Okay, here is the last state I'm going to drill you on before we jump into the three most recent books, which will probably go into the next break, but at least I want to introduce them before we get to that break. Okay, now, UFOs over New York. What sticks out in your mind, Preston?
I know it has had a number of UFO crashes. There was one over Maurice Harbor, which is, not too far away from that TWA 800 crash, which had a bunch of UFO implications to it. A bunch of UFOs were being seen around that time, and the crash is very close to where that occurred. And apparently this UFO may have been brought down by us using electronic weaponry. I'd have to look up that to get the details on it. I do know, I think it was Ray Fowler who got a case of a couple that was just driving along through this one area when they came upon apparently a crashed UFO surrounded by army trucks. A lot of these incidents rely on one or two witnesses, and that's all we got. It's one of the ironic things about UFO crashes is here we have evidence that's incontrovertible. It's hard evidence. It's proof. And yet, this is the best evidence we have. And the best evidence we have, we're relying on just a few eyewitness accounts, ultimately. So it's kind of there's weird irony to it. That it's the best evidence, and yet it's kind of the least supported cases.
Let me ask you this question. That famous federal fireman's manual that talks about the scenario of what to do if they come across a crashed flying saucer or whatever shape it is, and they have to deal with non-human entities, was that based in something that happened in New York, that scenario?
I couldn't answer that. I don't know. But I do find it fascinating that came out, because I remember when that information came out, it was a big deal because officially UFOs do not exist. And yet, obviously, that's wrong. Officially, they do if there's manuals on what to do if one crashes.
Now, before we get to break, I do at least want you to talk about the three most recent books you've written. And one of them, I don't even have volume 2 yet, which I will get. I do have volume 1, which I think is fantastic. And I'll just say the name of that one. That's Not From Here. Tell people what they're going to see and read in volume 3.
Yeah, I love this series of books. These are all based on articles I've written over the years for magazines, parts of my research that have not been available to people, in book form at least. And I was able to rework each article and get all the information to update it. And it's all about sort of rare and more unusual aspects of UFO research that you really don't hear a lot about. Like in volume 3, I discuss a bunch of cases in which people have actually observed abductions take place, which almost never happens. Or another chapter is about alien gifts. People have been given physical objects by UFOs, and it's, there's a lot of cases. Almost never happens, but there's a good 10 or 20 at least. Cases of UFOs contacted through the Ouija board. Talked about cases of people who were taken on aboard a UFO. This is probably my favorite chapter, and taken to the engine room and told how the UFO works and how they can build one of these things for themselves. And a bunch of people have tried to varying success. So all kinds of unusual cases.
Specifically to some of these people that have been brought to the engine rooms and told how these craft operate, were they also subject to having their memory forgotten and they had to go to a hypnotherapist, or did they actually remember what happened? Because that's a rare case for people to have full memory retention after an abduction or a contact or something like that.
Well, both. Certainly, there are ones who remembered spontaneously, some who remembered in the form of a dream, some who didn't actually get taken on board but had their minds flooded with information about how these UFOs work, which happens surprisingly often. I mean, I interviewed this one guy. He's on a plane over, I believe this was over Nevada, daytime, has a window seat. His wife is next to him. She's a stewardess. And this UFO comes darting right up and starts pacing the plane. And he says Preston was 50 feet away. It was right up against the plane. This is a jet, a passenger jet. Now, you don't get that close to another object. It just doesn't happen. That's considered a collision, really, near collision.
Yeah, it is. That's a really short space between those two. 50 feet is not far at all.
So he's looking at it going, oh, my God. And he says to his fiancée, look. And she's like, oh, my God. And it darts off. But while it was hovering there for just literally a couple of seconds, its mind was flooded with information. He's like, it works on magnetics. It works on some sort of electromagnetism. And he's like, I just got that feeling really, really strong. And we told me that. I'm like, yep, heard that before. So a number of cases come that way by just people who are approached by a UFO and downloaded.
Now, the two books, the more recent ones that we'll talk about when we come back from break, let's give a brief overview of them before we dissect them. Inside UFOs is one of them, and the other, of course, is Undersea UFO Base. And that one is also, I'm going to be a little biased towards because of the proximity to me and you. So take whichever one you want from first.
Well, Inside UFOs is probably my most popular book, at least recently, and I love it because this is all my own cases. Often my books involve casting a wide net and surveying a lot of researchers, programs, newspaper articles, books, so on. Inside UFOs is all my own research, all completely brand new cases, never before published, of people who've had very extensive contact, not just a sighting, but they were missing time. They were taken on board. They had face-to-face contact, and kind of surprised me. I think it sort of blows apart the myth that UFO contact is being examined by gray-type ETs and put back down. That does happen, but UFO contact is far, far stranger than that. And the cases in this book involve a wide variety of ETs. There are some grays, but there's also like one case involving a 9-foot-tall, orange-haired humanoid, another involving 15-foot-tall praying mantis type ETs, Nordic ETs, all kinds of variations of grays. So it's a lot stranger, I think. I mean, we can get into it. Some of the contact cases I picked were ones that I thought were not only credible and had great witnesses, Navy people, but were really unusual and had something to contribute to our understanding of, this phenomenon.
And that, everybody, after break, we will definitely dive into this book as well as Undersea UFO Base.
Right.
The Malibu base.
Yeah, that one took 10 years of research. I did not mean to write it, but I just kept getting cases, and I got pulled into being the USO guy. And so I'm like, fine, I'll do it. And finally, I got this book together, and I'm really pleased with it because I think I built a really strong argument for the probable or possible existence of an undersea base right off the coast here.
Now, we are about to take a break, but real quick, everybody, I just want to give a couple shout outs to Third Phase of the Moon, the Cousins brothers, Blake and Brent. Thank you for inspiring us and always bringing us the best UFO footage that you guys collect from around the world for everybody to analyze and some people have taken it one step further and have actually sent witnesses around. I also want to thank Pam Vrettenberg and the first Patreon patron, A.A. Nakamura from Hawaii. With that being said, folks, everybody stay tuned. We'll be right back in 3.5 short minutes.
The L&M Radio Network offers a moderated chat room at www.latenightinthemidlands.com. Just click the chat and listen page from the drop-down menu at the top of any page on the website, or click the Listen Live button at the top of the homepage at www.latenightinthemidlands.com.
To the believer, the evidence is overwhelming.
To the skeptic, there will never be enough.
Hello, everyone. This is Kevin Malik.
And this is Jennifer Chelsea Malik.
And we're your hosts, Paraversal Universe, live every Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern, 10 p.m. Grand Meridian in the UK.
And Saturday mornings in Australia, here on the Late Night in the Midlands Radio Network.
We invite you to join us as we check out the mysteries found within the 8 categories of the unknown and unexplained.
Join us as we interview the top minds in the perspective fields as they share theories and information regarding these unsolved mysteries.
Brought to you by the Northern Wisconsin Paranormal Society Limited.
So for excellent talk radio, check out Paraversal Universe, where all paranormal perspectives apply, Fridays on LNM.
Tired of the third dimension? Then tune into the Empowered Lightworker as we look at the incredible changes happening on this planet now. I'm author and channeler Caroline Oceana Ryan. Join me as I speak with authors, musicians, psychics, shamans, ET experiencers, people with insights that take us out of the illusions of everyday life and into new dimensions. Join us for the Empowered Lightworker, Tuesdays at 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. You're on lnmradionetwork.com in Studio B.
This is a warning, and it might be the only one that you get. For those who don't mind leaving the world unchanged, this is not for you. But for those who want something more, for those who wonder what it feels like to make a difference, this warning is for you. There is a profession where you work with the most volatile, explosive medium known to man. A career where challenging the status quo is part of your daily to-do list. A line of work where you lead those you love to struggle, fight, and conquer. The future hangs in the balance. You will wage war on things like doubt and I don't get it, with a relentless arsenal of yes you can. And consequentially, you will start raging fires of ambition that can never be extinguished. Also, I should warn you, your identity will be compromised and you will be known forever by those whose lives will change. So consider yourself warned. Should you take this on, you will leave a legacy, you will change the future, and you will feel what it's like to make it war. Okay, class, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Put your hands up if you're paying attention. Okay, now, we're gonna go over where we stopped last week.
First time I tried Vicodin, it was laying around my mom's house. And I kept taking them whenever I could get them. I didn't know they'd be this addictive. I didn't know how far I'd go to get more.
They gave me Vicodin after my knee surgery. They kept prescribing it, so I kept taking it. I didn't know it would be this addictive. I didn't know how far I'd go to get more.
Opioid dependence can happen after just 5 days. Know the truth, spread the truth.
L&M Radio Network, shining the light of truth 24 hours a day.
Okay, folks, welcome back to the second half of Dr. J Radio Live. I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels, as is my guest, Preston Dennett. We are internationally syndicated via late night in the Midlands, as well as Black Swap Digital Radio in the U.S., plus the terrestrial stations they are on. In the U.K., we have Deep Program Radio Network and the terrestrial stations in London and Leeds. And of course, I want to thank all those on YouTube Nation for being very interactive throughout the show. I already mentioned my guest, Preston Dennett. If you obviously caught the show late, you missed some great stuff about California and other states, but specifically California, of how he got me to open my mind far more than it ever was. Now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of one of the more recent books. I think it actually is the most recent book, Inside UFOs, Preston. Let me ask you about this. What is your favorite case throughout the entire book?
I'm going to have to say the first chapter, because it's got a great witness, a Navy medic, a corpsman. The encounter occurred aboard a Navy ship, and the guy was not abducted. He was invited aboard, and he saw 15-foot tall praying mantis type ETs. It's a crazy story. His friend, it turns out, his shipmate, the guy he shared a cabin with, was a personnel clerk and claimed to be a contactee. He just brings it up one day. Did you know I'm in contact with aliens? And the guy interviewed Kevin Kamen. It's like, no, you're kidding. Kevin believes in UFOs. He studied them as a kid. But his friend's like, yeah, they've been coming to me since I was a kid, and they've taken me on their ship many times. I've been to their planet and blah, blah, blah. And Kevin's like, yeah, right. If that's true, I want to meet your little green friends. And his friend's like, all right, I'll see what I can do. And to make a long story short, a couple of days later, his friend comes down and says, they're here. You want to come up and see them? They're here. Just go up on deck. And Kevin's like, oh, fine. All right. Yeah, right. It's high noon. Lunch had just started. Goes up onto the deck and can't believe his eyes. There's this huge kind of diamond star-shaped craft. It's really bright. It's got all kinds of colored lights on it. It's right alongside the ship, a little bit out there to the side, and at least 3 times the size of this, 600-foot ship. Huge. And he's looking at it, and he does what anyone should do when they see a UFO. He tries to get other witnesses. There's a bunch of people on the deck of the ship, obviously. Runs up to the cook there and is shaking his shoulder and cannot get his attention. It's like he's not even there. And the next thing, Kevin knows he's not. He's aboard the ship. He's looking down at the Navy ship, which is now receding off into the distance, as if the craft he's on is shooting out into outer space, which apparently it is. And it's a long story, but I'll shorten it a little bit. He was taken over to his hometown in Kankakee, Illinois. He saw his mom And then they showed him his dad. Both were there at work. They must have time traveled or something because it was also daytime there, which didn't make sense with this time difference. And next thing he knows, he's looking down. The ship moves again, and he's looking down through the floor. You can see through the floor, and it looks like craters. And he's thinking, is this a bombed area? Is this the desert? What's going on? It almost looks like the moon. When they come up over the horizon, and sure enough, it's the moon, because there's the Earth about the size of a softball, way, way off in the distance. And he became very frightened and finally started talking to these guys. He was too afraid to turn around, but he heard these voices in his head talking to him. He asked them, where are you from? And the entire ship kind of expanded in size, the room itself, and became several hundred feet in diameter and darkened and became this star chart. And this little red light blinked off in the distance. You could see the whole Milky Way. You could see our solar system. And way, way off in the distance is this little red light. And they're like, that's us. And they proceeded to tell him all kinds of stuff, that they were in touch, working with various governments of our planet, all the major governments, trading technology, that they could speak all the Earth languages, that Roswell happened, that since we started exploding nuclear bombs, we started a countdown clock, and there's going to be major disasters. And then they showed him all these disasters that would happen. So it's a long, involved story. He finally did turn around and looked at these guys, and he says they were giant praying mantis, completely white, really big eyes, so big like the size of a basketball. And one walks towards him, comes right up next to him and fussing with the panel there that had like little oven dials on it, he said. But he says this thing was 15 feet tall. And I'm like, probably closer to 10. I wanted to talk him down because most of the cases I get are about 9 feet tall. Maybe he's like, no, this was 15 feet tall. It was, taller than a basketball board. He's a trained observer, so I couldn't doubt him. I've since gotten other cases involving 15-foot tall praying mantis ETs. But that case is a doozy.
Yeah, obviously, definitely sounds like it. And I've never heard up until now about a 15-foot tall ET, which also begs the question, how many different, well, it's more than ETs. I'll just say non-human civilizations that are visiting us, whether it be from different planets, galaxies, timelines, dimensions, all of the above. Because I've heard estimates from what Clifford Stone has said. I believe he said it was like 57, 58, around 60-ish, to what Carrie Cassidy once said, around 250. Through your research, and you've done a lot in these 22 books, and you've spoken a lot, what estimate would you yourself think is the most accurate based on the number of people you've interviewed and the stories you wrote?
Right. Well, the problem is it's kind of infinite. We've got a parade marching through. There's so many stars. There's so many different species. The vast majority are humanoid in some respect. I mean, almost all of them. But, there's, of course, the three main types, the Nordic, the Greys, and praying mantis. There's reptilian. There's a number of different types of Greys. There's all kinds of dwarf humanoids, short humanoids, light beings. And beyond this, there's a catch-all category. And what we're looking at is species that don't necessarily have a project or a connection to Earth, but are just kind of passing through or studying, I'm guessing. But as far as like the Greys or the Nordics and the mantis, they clearly have a mission on Earth, and they're working hard. They have an agenda. I think we've got a pretty good handle on what it is. So they're very involved with us. And
now, let me ask you, because you mentioned the fact that this gentleman who was interacting with these 15-foot tall white praying mantises was brought to his parents' house, and you mentioned the fact that it seemed there might have been some time travel involved. Have you had any other cases, or have you come across any other cases that you've researched that involve time travel?
Yes, and it keeps turning up, and there's another case in the book like this. In that first case, his friend actually did time travel and says, I saw your house, and started describing Kevin's house as it was back in 1970. All these things, there's no way he could have known. So there's kind of double indications that those ETs could do time travel. But I got another case involving a gentleman by the name of, well, I call him Taylor. And man, he started out having this really interesting incident. He lived in Missouri. He was just like 9 years old or 11 years old. And his mom sends him out to mail a letter. He ends up having missing time. But over the next few days, he recalls being taken aboard a craft and seeing these Nordic type ETs who had this long philosophical conversation with him and changed his life. He says he suddenly became aware in a way he could not even describe. That's something I've heard from a number of witnesses. But following this, they moved out of St. Louis and out into the country. They started having a lot of sightings. And he would go out into the backyard and he'd see gray type ETs. And he'd think they were deer, and then they'd transform into an ET and he'd have missing time. Well, one time he's outside, the whole family's out there, it's a large family, and this UFO shows up right there. It's right over the trees, real close to the house, and everyone's screaming, they're running around, oh my God, pointing. Well, he decides, Taylor, to run inside and get his rifle because it has a scope on it. And he wants to not shoot it, but to look at this thing close up, runs back outside, lifts up the scope, and he can see the UFO, and then it's gone. He can't see it. He's like, well, that's weird. Puts down the scope and is looking around and can't believe his eyes. His time has stopped. His family is not moving. His father's holding a bucket with the liquid sloshing out. The trees aren't moving, birds in the sky. Everything's frozen like a statue, except him. And so he's very disoriented, and he's looking around trying to figure out what's going on when he sees that the UFO has not gone away like he thought. It's landed in the front yard, in the driveway, and out come 3 gray ETs, and that's all he remembers. Them walking towards him.
I've always wondered myself about time travel because I thought, how could you get around the grandfather paradox? Yet we know that if we can affect a gravitational wave on the time-space continuum, you can essentially have basically a lot of the crafts, if they're able to create an Einstein-Rosen bridge, aka a wormhole, they are by default also time travel machines or time machines. So I guess it wasn't until Bob Lazar, the Bob Lazar tapes, when he made his own little documentary, that I really started to pay attention. But it's still, in my mind, I can't wrap around the fact. How do you get around the grandfather paradox? If you were to go into a time machine now and go back, say, 100 years and kill off your paternal and maternal great-grandparents of both sides, that way there would be no lineage towards you. Wouldn't you, by default, just disappear?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing about time travel is there aren't a bunch of time travel machines laying around, are there? Nope. So apparently it's hard to do. Because even if it was true, then you could just come back and bring a machine along. Well, there's got to be some limitations to it, whether it's ethical or logistical or mechanical, you know what I mean? But as far as grandfather paradox, from what I understand, it's not a paradox. There's just probable and alternate realities that sort of pile up against each other. And what's happened has happened, and you can play with variations of it to your heart's content. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's my latest theory.
Let me ask you about the WOJ. Tell us about them. Who are they?
Yeah, this is a guy I interviewed, Stan Hughes. He's a Native American, full-blooded, blood Indian from Canada. And the WOJ are what he calls the star people, and he considers them his ancestors. And I've talked to a number of Native Americans, and his story is typical in that it's very benevolent encounters. It started for him up in Lake Pend Oreille in the Idaho Panhandle, where he'd take his whole family, and they'd watch these, they called them NLs, nocturnal lights, as they were hovering over the lake there. Well, one time they're going up there and they're watching these things, and one of these things comes right down to their level. They're overlooking the lake on this bluff, and it's just maybe 50, 100 feet away. And the little girl, his daughter, says, Daddy, they're talking to me. What should I say? And he's like, oh my gosh, tell him I love you. So she says, I love you, in her sweet little voice. And this UFO flares up, a big, bright, bright blue, dips down, comes right over their head, and takes off. And so they all kind of felt like it was saying hello.
Wow.
And so this is how he started having contact. And like one time he's out camping. This is at Thunder Mountain nearby, might be Washington. And he sees this UFO and it comes real close to him and he starts to feel this incredible dread, this really bad feeling like something is wrong. And the UFO backs up. And it comes close and he feels that same feeling of fear. And it did this 3, 4, 5 times and finally just left. And he's like, something is wrong. Something is really wrong. And he went home the next day and found out that, there was a crisis at his house. His son was having an emotional crisis.
Over how many years did these Woj communicate with this family or what duration of time would you put it from the beginning to the end, or is it still happening?
It's still happening. It was over a period of years. He would have, some sightings that were close up and some not so close. Another really interesting one was where he was attending a Native American healing for one of his relatives or part of his tribe, and there was a bunch of people there, 30 people attending this sort of traditional healing ceremony. And right afterwards, this UFO shows up. Solid metallic craft right above the trees, humming. They all saw it. And they're like, it came to celebrate this healing. But it's best encounter. I have to tell you this because this is just really remarkable. And I've heard of other cases like this, but this is the first time I got to interview anyone who had this happen to them, where he was driving along at the base of Thunder Mountain, along this dirt road in his pickup truck. His dog's next to him. It's early morning. And he starts to feel a little strange, drowsy kind of. And he hears this whooshing noise coming from above his car, and suddenly coming up from behind him over his car, this object lands right in front of him on the road. He says it's about the size of a small house. It's metallic, like chrome, really like mirror, like silver. And it's hovering about a foot off the road there. And he's feeling like, gosh, what is going on here? He feels his dog doesn't react at all, just kind of sleeping there, when this opening appears and out steps this beautiful looking man. He says it was the most handsome man he's ever seen. He had shoulder length hair. He had dark skin, looked maybe Arabic or Middle Eastern, dark eyes, had a blue jumpsuit on, and I believe it was silver boots, and very muscular and very, handsome. And had this look in his eyes of just utter compassion. They lock eyes. The guy lifts his hand and kind of waves. And Stan feels this huge wave of longing, this yearning to go with him. Says, take me with you. Take me with you. And the guy's face dropped. He dropped his hand, turned around, gave one last look, turned around, walked back on the ship, and the ship takes off straight up.
The times that I've heard about these human-looking ETs, I almost always get the same description, that they have perfect muscles. They are as perfect as can be. Do you think that has, I don't know, do you think it has to do with genetics? I mean, again, this is speculation. Yeah. So it's genetically engineered to be that way.
I think so. Yeah, because they're all about genetics. The Greys and the Nordics often appear together. It's a number of cases, and they're typically described when they're in groups. And I've got cases like this myself of looking very similar. Not only brother and sister, but twins even.
Wow.
So, I mean, what is that? I mean, ETs are all about twins too, by the way.
It's true. It's true. And of course, we do know from women who are abducted and who have had children that are impregnated and then the children removed either in the first or early second trimester, they all of a sudden have these litter of hybrids that occasionally they're brought back to meet them on board ships. And there are several cases about that. But that's a whole another topic that we could go down that rabbit hole another time. I want to stay with this right now because I have a very important question to ask you, Preston. You've written 22 books, countless articles. You've interviewed a number of people. I don't want to say a bad word, but I was about to say the S word, S-load word people. And you've spoken a lot, and you are so full of information. My question is to you is, how do you find all these people that have these experiences? Because I was at your house that one time when we were interviewing that child who was part of the Catalina incident. And that was just one of the mind-blowing things that I got to see your research being conducted firsthand. So again, back to the original question, how do you find all these people?
Yeah, sometimes it seems more than coincidence, I can tell you that. Initially, I started out very aggressive, asking my friends, family, and coworkers, and found a good 25% at least were having encounters. And I networked from there and soon had a pretty strong network. This is well before email even. So I've been at this a long time. And each time I speak at a convention, people come up to me. That's how I found Kevin Kamen. I went down to San Diego and he was there. And he was looking at these praying mantis drawings I had. He's like, I think they look a little different. And he started talking. So at conventions, certainly from shows like this, I have a website, which you can contact me through my website, and I get a lot of stuff through there. And just in weird places, the bank or, the post office or something, grocery store, weird places, people will come up to me and we'll start talking. Like, next thing you know.
I think you were made to do this, Preston, definitely. I think they probably tapped you subconsciously, somehow said, he's going to be one of the people to spread this information. He's going to be the person that other humans can trust with their stories because he is not going to spin it and tell it exactly the way it is. And that's one thing I love about reading your books is you're very meticulous about them. Now, this is a question a lot of people ask, and a lot of people have so many different answers, and others like me are still questioning why. And then even those skeptics sort of ask the inverse question. Why are aliens here? And when I say skeptics ask the inverse questions, they would say, if there are aliens, why would they be here?
Right. Well, I think we know to a large extent, certainly with the Greys, because their agenda has been demonstrated through their actions. You can say all you want, but we know what they're doing. And what they're doing is collecting genetic material. And that's absolutely one of their main agendas is creating a hybrid race. Beyond that, we know they've collected all kinds of plants, all kinds of animals. I wrote about this in both my Not From Here books. So they're interested in all things human. They know more about the human body, I think, than we do. So for some reason, they're very, very attracted to us. And exactly why is hard to say. But in terms of people who are taken on board, they're given messages, and it falls into three main areas. By and large, the most common is being given warnings of environmental disaster of some kind. Nuclear proliferation, pollution, overpopulation, warlike ways, ozone layers, this sort of thing is what the number one alien message is. Why are you polluting your planet? Why are you so violent?
I get the feeling that they're more worried about the planet than us as a human race, because I have a feeling they could just literally take a litter of us that they create, put us on another planet, and let us destroy ourselves, save the Earth, and then repopulate it with whatever they want to. That's just obviously a scenario that is one of many that I've thought about, but I guess the question is, let's just hope that doesn't happen. That would be the best way to say it. Okay, these next two questions, one of them actually, we both know people that are involved in this field we know them very directly, and that has to do with hypnosis. For instance, Yvonne Smith is one of them. We know her very well from her Zero group. How important is hypnosis?
Very important. We know it works. It's been demonstrated to work, and it's been very, very useful in this field in particular, which does have cases that are shrouded in amnesia. I absolutely support it. I think it's done a tremendous job of verifying what's going on with people. And the accounts that come out under hypnosis match very closely the accounts that are fully conscious. I saw a show, Mythbusters. I don't know if you've ever seen that show where they
Yes.
They did an episode on regressive hypnosis once. They staged an office incident where they had some guy come in there and, create a ruckus, and he left. And then they're like, here's our experiment. We're putting you under regressive. First, they had them all remember what they could consciously, write it down. Now, mind you, this is immediately after the incident, right after it occurred. They wrote down all this stuff, right? And then they went under hypnosis, and it worked. It worked amazingly to the point where they could recall intense detail. So we know it worked, and it's been used to solve crimes many times. However, I don't think it's necessarily a good idea for people to go running to hypnosis first off. There's a lot of people who recall their encounters afterwards through dreams. That's not at all unusual. Or spontaneously, also not unusual. I mean, I had a case up in Idaho where a guy bit on his wisdom tooth, and all the missing time that he had as a child, and this missing time incident came flooding back into his mind. So there's kind of spontaneous cues and triggers that might be set up by the ETs to let people remember when it perhaps won't be as traumatic.
It sounds to me that what these ETs are telling us and then having us forget immediately, and just as you mentioned, hypnosis is one way to get it, or there are certain triggers that allow us to remember it. Do you think there's going to be some sort of cataclysm that will finally get everybody who's had every experience to say, wait a second, I know what's about to happen. I'm involved in this, or I'm supposed to do this. What do you think?
Well, I worry about the ET's constant warnings of environmental disaster. I can't tell you how many abductees, experiencers, contactees, call them what you're comfortable with, have told me that they have these series of apocalyptic dreams, or don't drink the water, and all the cars are stuck on the freeway, and ships are coming in large numbers, and the sky is a different color, and certain details like that recur. It's one thing, one person says these details, but to have it repeatedly come up, I'm like, gosh, yeah, I worry about it.
I absolutely worry too, especially now. We have these massive earthquakes that are, it's not normal to have so many quakes over 9.0 or something like that, or these tsunamis that we have. Begs the question, is something that we've done is causing this? Is this what they're warning us about? Again, that leads to a lot of speculation, but it also falls in line with their warnings. And again, the first thing we do when we figure out how to split an atom is we create a weapon out of it. That just goes to show our nature, which is not obviously the best thing, because we're always looking how to outdo another country. Now I'm going to turn this around on you, Preston. Have you had any contact?
Yeah, I certainly have, and I don't know what degree it is. I cannot find anything in my childhood. I really can't. I'm not going to say it doesn't occur, because first of all, it is in my family. My sister-in-law had a face-to-face encounter with gray-type ETs and a close-up UFO sighting. My other sister-in-law had entity encounters. My brother chased a UFO. He has what looks like an implant in his arm. No kidding. So my nephews both have had sightings. One had an entity encounter in his bedroom. So it's in my family. My first sighting was when I went down to Santa Monica. I just started investigating UFOs, and I went to see this contactee, Andy Rice. And after the meeting, he called down a UFO. Couldn't believe it. Looked like a shooting star, but he pointed to the sky and said, here it comes, here it comes. And this is downtown Santa Monica. You can't see a star in the sky. This shooting star appears. Kind of ambiguous, but my best early one, and this was 1992 or so, I'm driving home to my condo in Canoga Park. It's kind of how I know the date. I moved there not long ago. And it's, July, late at night, and this ball of light comes dropping down out of the sky, and it comes right in front of my car. Honest to God, this thing was maybe the size of a golf ball. I'm thinking, oh, it's a bird, but it's clearly not. It's this round ball of light, and it goes back and forth 2, maybe 3 times, about 2 feet in front of my windshield, dips down in front of the car, and then goes straight up through this, the trees there and out into outer space. Gone. This little probe-like thing. And here's the weird thing. I forgot about that. I didn't tell anybody. I don't remember that for 4 years, 5 years.
What triggered that for you to finally remember that?
That's another thing that I'm like, when did I start talking about this?
Yeah.
When did I remember this? Because I don't know. It's just suddenly one day, I'm like, hey, I remember that. And someone pointed out, you may have had missing time. I'm like, well, I don't remember going home that night. I don't remember anything remarkable occurring, but I sure as hell remember that ball of light. I really do. It happened again. Happened to me on the freeway on the way to a UFO meeting to see Stephen Greer and Richard Boylan and the CSETI group. This thing drops out of the sky on the freeway. And I'm like, what? There's cars all around me. That I don't even know.
What year was this when you were on your way to see Greer?
God, that would have to be not long after that, mid-1990s. I couldn't tell you the exact date. I'd have to really buckle down and narrow it down. But yeah, the freeway was filled with cars too.
I have a question here from someone in the YouTube chat. Adderike Studios asks, what is the most terrifying or disturbing fact or story you've ever heard?
Most terrifying or disturbing? Well, I don't get a whole lot of really scary stories, to be perfectly honest. I don't get what I would call like cases involving sadism or torture or evil. So that's a difficult question. As far as I've personally interviewed, well, God, some people do have a hard time with this stuff, certainly in a lot of cases. It can be very scary. One gentleman I interviewed, this is also in the book Inside UFOs, he had encounters with gray type ETs and had a bunch of missing time. And he suffered horrendously medically from a number of these incidents where he'd wake up and he'd have all these cuts, these scars, burns on his body. It was very difficult for him. So I do run into negative cases, but nothing that's like super bone-chilling type of thing.
Now, we have a little over 15 minutes left, so I'm going to try to compact as much as possible in this because this is an important topic. And you've written an entire book, which we talked about earlier, Undersea UFO Base. Before we even dive into the base, and since I told you before the show that I mentioned this not too long ago, people would rather hear it from an expert such as yourself. Can you tell people the difference between a UFO and a USO?
Yeah, UFO, unidentified flying object. USO is unidentified submersible object. And a UFO will be flying along, hits the water, and boom, it's a USO. But here's the problem. There's really no difference, except you can't call a UFO when it's not even flying and it's underwater. So it's just a way to sort of term these things, to call something to call them. We've had a whole semantic disaster with the entire UFO field since day one. And I don't think we're going to get out of it. People are trying to call UFOs something else, UAPs. I don't think it's going to catch on. We're kind of stuck with the term UFO. And yeah, USOs are unidentified submersible objects, but they're essentially the same thing. And these things have the ability to go through water in a way that certainly we don't have. There's typically no splash. In a number of these cases, they're moving in excess of hundreds of miles an hour, just like they do in the sky, darting from side to, horizon to horizon. This is how they're moving underwater in a number of cases. and probably most they're not. They don't move nearly as fast underwater for whatever reason, but they can.
Now, because me and you both live close to Malibu, let's talk about the Malibu base for those listening here throughout the US and the UK and the EU, if not other parts of the world. What anomaly exists there? I know I've seen it, and I'd rather have you comment on it because I know you've done a lot more research on this topic.
Right. Now, mind you, I'm not the first. I'm kind of a latecomer to this area. Anne Druffel, she's calling it a hotspot back in the 1970s. Yvonne Smith has cases here. Bill Hamilton, Barbara Lamb, all the locals know about it. This area off the coast is hugely active. And I got reports from the beginning, and I started documenting them. And I documented 170 cases. And this was my first real data point, like, gosh, what's going on here? Because it's not like this anywhere else, really, in the world. Certainly not in Northern California or, off the coast of Mexico or Oregon or Washington or the East Coast. As far as I know, this is one of the top producers of USO reports. And it's been going on since at least the 1920s to the current day. So how do you explain all these sightings in a sharply defined area over such a long period of time? It's my first data point pointing towards there's something going on here. So I charted them all. I put them on a map, and I put them all, gave them little dots, and they clustered probably most thickly right off the coast of Malibu, right? So I'm like, this is interesting. Now years go by, and I'm contacted by this guy on the internet. He's like, do you know about this anomaly? And he shows me this Google image showing this very flat top of a underwater area. I'm like, that's really interesting. And I thanked him for the information, and I researched it a little bit. Robert Stanley, he's also a pioneering researcher, had discovered this, I think it was 2004 or so, or 2006, some time back. And he noted it and made a few tweets about it. And then it was, I think, Jimmy Church who busted this all wide open using Google applications and showed that this thing apparently has a tunnel. And if you look at some of these images, this is an anomaly off the coast of Malibu. It's underwater, thousands of feet. And it's huge, for one thing. It's got a very flat top. It appears to have a number of what look like columns or pillars. And most remarkably is what appears to be a tunnel. And it's right smack in the center of all this activity.
To your knowledge, to the best of your knowledge, do you know if anyone has tried to enter it via a submersible or a submersible drone or something like that, or maybe even a scuba diver, if that was even possible?
Right. Well, I know that nearby Morro Air Force Base knows about it because one of the MUFON field investigators called them up and they're like, yeah, we're aware of the rumors of the base, and they're not true. But I've got a number of Navy witnesses from this area who said that, yeah, they've seen the craft themselves and can't identify them. And also the show Location with Rob Lowe and his two sons explored the Malibu anomaly with an unmanned submersible. They went down there. It was a shoestring budget. It was a day-long shoot. So they couldn't, spend a time and attention and money they really need to explore this thing. But they got to the surface of it and they examined it. And they found no evidence of artificial construction. They didn't see any tunnel. They got to the base of it, apparently. Visibility wasn't great, and they didn't have a lot of time. So I was a little disappointed with the extent of the investigation, but it was a good first attempt, certainly. I'm on the fence about it. I'm telling you.
Let me ask you this, because there are so many military bases on that coast near Malibu to the north and south of it, do you think there's a possibility that what people are seeing is actually military test vehicles that could even be reverse engineered, or do you think they're actually seeing non-terrestrial vehicles that are piloted by non-terrestrial beings?
Non-terrestrial, and I'll tell you why. I mean, certainly it's possible some of these are our own. But I'm going to say the vast majority No. Yes, there's a lot of military in this area. There's, like I said, the Air Force Base right to the Morro Bay there. I don't believe that's what it's called. It's got another name. Then to the south, there's San Clemente Island, which is totally military. Then there's along the coast there, Seal Beach Naval Weapons Station. There's, LA Airport right along this whole area. Lots of crowded military and technological installations. But here's the problem. The activity has been going on for way too long for this to be military, for one thing. But there's modern-looking reports stretching back to the 20s, before we had any types of these craft or could possibly. Second, there's a number of these sightings which are taking place over major population centers, to the extent that, there's a display going on for these witnesses. They're being chased down the road in their cars. These objects are hovering over their homes. They're being abducted. This is completely contrary to how the military tests their own aircraft. Thirdly, 20% of the cases, these objects are being chased by military jets. Fourth, when people are taken on board, they're not seeing military. They're seeing aliens. There's so many different reasons why this isn't military. A lot of the witnesses themselves are military. I talked to a submarine navigator. He saw something along the north end here, says it wasn't military. I talked to a gentleman who was an officer on a Navy ship on the seaside of Catalina, and none of them could identify what they were looking at. These are naval officers themselves. So
now, let me ask you this. You are also known as the worldwide expert of USOs, specifically in the Pacific Ocean. Are there any other hot spots for USO activity that may indicate other bases in the Pacific Ocean?
Puerto Rico seems to have a lot. I understand there's some activity on the East Coast. North Carolina, I think it is. I've got cases coming from a little lake in Hot Springs, Arkansas, Lake Hamilton. Probably my best case, this guy was a submarine electrician's mate on the USS Clamagore, which carried nuclear missiles. It was not known at the time, but it did. And he'd been on a number of other subs. Nothing happened. He gets on this, something really strange happened. They're heading up the East Coast. This is 1970 at night. They're heading about maybe 12 knots. They're on the surface, and he's assigned to watch with another petty officer. The commander's up there and the second in command when this USO comes zooming up from behind, from the stern, and starts pacing their submarine. It's right off, 50 feet off. It's just beneath the water there. It's 20, 30 feet wide, hard to say, really bright, totally silent. The commander turns to Ray Sachs, the guy I interviewed, and says, what do the sonar guys see? And they didn't see anything. This was not appearing on sonar. And one by one, the major officers came up on deck because they wanted to look at this thing, and they did. They all filed up, looked at it, couldn't identify it, went back below. It paced them for about 15 minutes, took off at about 50 knots in another direction, and the second in command turns to the captain and says, "Captain, how do you want me to write this down in the log?" And the commander says, "Officers who write down these types of incidents do not move up in rank."
Wow.
So it was not recorded and covered up. I'm assuming the commander must have told his superior at some point. I hope so. But, they told Ray not to talk about it. The second guy in command is like, "Shut up, you guys, don't talk about this." Well, they went down below. Ray goes below, and every person is waiting to hear what he saw. So, of course, he told him. And it's like, "You never signed anything." I'm like, "Are you sure it's all right to tell me this?" He's like, "They never made me sign anything, so I'm telling you." He's an elderly man.
When was the first time you heard the word or the term USO? And to the best of your knowledge, who coined that phrase, USO?
I don't know. I think probably Ivan T. Sanderson was the first to really write about this in his book, Invisible Residents. I know Charles Fort had a few cases, but he had cases of everything. He's the real, paranormal pioneer. But Ivan Sanderson was the first guy who really looked into it. Carl Feint runs a water UFO website, and he's the real go-to guy on worldwide reports, certainly, and this in general. I got sucked into it because I was having so many cases, and I started to get asked to speak about it. I wrote an article for Fate magazine speculating about the possibility of this base. And I tell you, the data just keeps piling up. Before this, anomaly, going back to the anomaly with the alleged tunnel, skeptics say, no, it's no tunnel. The Google images are lying. They're stitched together. And it's true, some show it, some don't. So I don't know how you can really rely on either side of that. I'm a little on the fence about it, except for the fact that I've been contacted by a number of whistleblowers 3 or 4 times. And at least one who I consider pretty reliable says, you know about this tunnel, right, in that area? And I'm like, no, this was well before this anomaly was, went viral. And I'm like, what tunnel? And they said get this, comes out in this, San Pedro, Santa Catalina area, but stretches, and it's huge, underwater, submarines can go through it. It goes all the way to Area 51, or actually Edwards Air Force Base, which leads to Area 51. And they're all connected. Crazy.
Now, because we're coming very close on time, there are several other topics and questions within those topics that we could definitely talk about, but we're going to have to save it for next time. So let me clump these 2 things together in one. One, tell us and everybody out there who's listening what you're working on now and what's next for you, as well as you mentioned your website, and talk about where people can buy these books, because you have 22 of them. I have a library full of them, and I'm still incomplete with all of them.
Hey, I appreciate it. I've made this my life's mission. It's a subject I take very seriously. I think it's going to change the world. It already has. And I appreciate you having me on the show. You can reach me through my website, which if you just Google my name, it should take you there. The actual address is prestondennett.weebly.com, and got excerpts there. You can contact me through my website. Love to hear from people if they've got a story or a question or a comment. And definitely always working on stuff. Going to put out another volume of Not From Here, volume 4. But more importantly, I'm working on another book about UFO healings. That was my first book 20 plus years ago, 100 cases. Well, I've got over 300 now. Getting a lot of requests for this book, and I'm super excited about it.
That's one topic that I wanted us to cover, but we ran out of time. Briefly, real quick, are you going to do any other states UFOs over so-and-so?
I would love to do all of them, but people are catching on now. Other people are writing these books. There's a lot of states still open, and I want to continue working on them. Absolutely.
Well, it would be great. Everybody out there, I highly suggest you read Preston Dennett's books. You will be blown away. You will be very happy that you got them, and the information in there is invaluable. First of all, let me give some shout outs to, again, Pam Vrettenberg for her work behind the scenes, doing a little extra promotion. We also have to thank the people who are the audio engineers and the station managers at Late Night in the Midlands, Katie and Daryl Neely. I also want to thank Wise Frog from Black Swamp Digital Radio and JC of Deprogrammed Radio Network in the United Kingdom. And of course, also with L&M, I do want to thank Michael Vara, the owner of that network. If it wasn't for him, there would be no L&M, and there would be no 2 studios full of shows. I also want to thank everybody listening on YouTube. That is, of course, another great place for you guys to listen, and you can also write your questions. As you see, I try to do my best to pay attention to them. And remember, folks, the only thing you have to remember when it comes to the show is the name of it. Dr. J Radio Live. That is DRJ Radio Live. Everything from the YouTube channel, Minds, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, Google, Pinterest, whatever you could think of, it's there. Patreon is another one. Buffer. The point is just go to the website, drjradiolive.com, drjradiolive.com, and you will see it right there. With that being said, folks, remember, disclosure is in your hands. Everybody, Join us back tomorrow night for Kane Hodder. That's right, Kane Hodder, a paranormal specialist and a celebrity who played Jason in the Friday the 13th series. With that being said, folks, this is Dr. J, and I am officially signing off.